All right, guys. Hope everybody had a good weekend. We're going to keep taking notes on Cnidaria and Ctenophora or Ctenophora, depending on how you want to pronounce it. I think both are probably acceptable. We talked about kind of the basics of what makes Cnidarians Cnidarians. And the big thing on that is those stinging cells. In fact, they're made of two cell layers, a one opening digestive system. But they are the first group that we see tissues in. They really don't have organs and organ systems. They're still very, very simple in that regard. There are four basic classes that we have in the phylum Cnidaria. Remember your orders of classification: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So class is right below phylum. The class Scyphozoa are what you would commonly call the jellyfish. The medusa shape is the dominant shape. I think there are a few species that have a polyp stage in their life cycle. Most of them are marine. There are a couple freshwater examples, but they're pretty few and far between. Anthozoa are the sea anemones and the corals. Mainly polyps, all polyps actually, characterized by the fact that they look like flowers. That's actually where anthozoa comes from. It basically means flower animal. Okay. Corals also fall into this group. The big difference between anemones and corals is anemones are very much free-living, soft-tissued animals. Corals secrete a calcium carbonate kind of casing around them that the polyp structure organism lives in, and they tend to live as a result of that in very, very large groups of many, many hundreds, even thousands of organisms together. And so they are definitely more colonial, even though they are individual multicellular organisms. Most of our freshwater cnidarians are in the class Hydrozoa. Hydro means water. Okay, and these are the hydras. They exist as polyp forms only. They're nearly microscopic. You can see them with the naked eye, but barely. They're found in most every freshwater source, certainly any clean freshwater source. Probably not something you've ever really seen or come into contact with because of their size. Usually when we're around freshwater, we aren't looking for really, really small things. And then there's a group called the box jellies, or the phylum Cubozoa, cube-shaped animals. Right? So a whole wide variety of these, but they're all very, very simple. Again, main characteristic outside of that two cell layers and one opening digestive system is those stinging cells that they use to capture their prey. All are capable of movement to some extent, even if that's just the movement of extending and retracting their tentacles. Anemones can kind of slide along on their base, kind of the bottom of that polyp. Jellyfish don't really swim so much as they're carried by currents, but by flexing and relaxing the muscle fibers in that bell of that medusa shape, they can move with some purposefulness and directionality. Primarily, they move toward or away from light, usually toward light, because that's where they're going to find their food. They don't necessarily set out in the ocean and say, okay, I'm going to go here. Very, very simple stimulus response type thing. So let's start with the anthozoans. Sea anemones are brightly colored, resemble flowers. That helps attract their prey to them. And like I said, they live as solitary polyps. They feed primarily on little invertebrates, small shrimp and the like, fish, and so forth. Anything that comes into contact with those tentacles, it's going to get paralyzed by those stinging cells. They're going to fold the tentacles into the mouth and take them in and digest them, release the waste, and so forth. Corals are very, very similar, but instead of being single individuals, they are primarily colonial. Many, many, many individual organisms living together in one big limestone case that they secrete. And if you look at that picture of a coral to the right, it's a little hard to tell even if you've got this full screen, but you can kind of see these little hair-like projections coming out along the sides of this. Those are the tentacles of those individual corals. And each place you see a hole on there is where there's one of those individual polyps living within that case. Hydrozoans exist only as polyps. Okay? They tend to be very, very small. Their reproduction is mainly by budding. We're going to see sexual reproduction a lot more common in anemones and corals, and the anthozoans. These guys primarily will grow an extension off a little bud. It will break off and start a new individual. They are only found in freshwater, with one exception I'll mention a little later. But usually they're a good indicator of very clean freshwater. They tend to not survive well in environments with a lot of pollution or without a very stable food supply and so forth. Since they're in such a very specific thing, type environment, obviously asexual reproduction works well for them. They can move along this kind of disc on the bottom here, okay? But the main way that they move is by somersaulting. They will actually bend over and kind of attach to the substrate with their tentacles, release the base, and just kind of twist themselves over and somersault. And I am going to pull up a short video for you on that here. Okay, so here's a little video of how Hydra move. You see it's extending itself out there on the left. It's taking its tentacles, it's kind of grabbing onto the substrate, and it just kind of flips itself on over. And they will pretty much move around that way in order to get closer to a better food source. Some of these guys have symbiotic photosynthetic algae that live in them, so they'll move to get into a place with a little more light and so forth. But they're kind of cool little boogers, pretty active. This video actually says that these were filmed on Lake Chautauqua in New York, okay? And Lake Chautauqua is a freshwater lake, obviously a very clean freshwater lake. Okay, so basic body plan. Again, remember, these guys are cnidarians, so an outer cell layer and an inner cell layer, one opening to the digestive system, one big cavity where they digest everything, stinging cells, cnidocytes on these tentacles up here. They can reproduce sexually. As you see here, they actually develop an egg on the side. They release their sperm into the water and capture sperm from the water, very much the same way as what we saw in sexual reproduction in sponges. Here's a picture of a hydra feeding on an animal commonly called a water flea. Its technical name is Daphnia. Very, very simple crustacean. One kind of oddball example of the hydras. I said most of these guys are freshwater, and that is true. There is a saltwater one that actually is a colonial organism. Hundreds, if not thousands, of individual hydra living together with these big, long tentacles extending from them, making up what is called the Portuguese man-o-war. People often think the Portuguese man-o-war is a jellyfish or a jelly. It is not. It's a group of hydrozoans, thousands of them together. Big long tentacles that they use to sting their prey, and then the polyps, those within the colony of those, will feed on whatever that prey may be. And they develop this big gas-filled air float that keeps them up near the surface where they're more likely to find their prey rather than sinking down to the bottom of the ocean. Here's just kind of a drawing you see of one. Gives you an idea of the size of these things. Okay, literally hundreds of individual polyps living together, kind of right below the water surface. This gas float holding them up there, and then very, very long tentacles, 150 feet long or more, that they're going to capture things. They are definitely one of the most poisonous when it comes to their venom, when it comes to their stinging cells, of any of the cnidarians. They will kill humans if you get tangled up in one. As I mentioned, generally these guys are going to reproduce asexually by budding. When they do reproduce sexually, a piece actually buds off and goes into a medusa form, and they reproduce sexually in that medusa form primarily, and then form a zygote that forms a free-swimming larva that then is going to develop into its own individual polyp. This is the life cycle of one called Obelia. It's one of the more well-studied ones. Not all of them are going to do this. There's one thing we definitely see with these simple animals is a very wide variety of how they do things. All right, cubozoans are called the box jellyfish. Tend to be extremely poisonous. A lot of these are found in the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, those areas, probably because we've got a lot of reef communities in those areas. I got a video I'll pull up for you guys later on these guys, but not something we're going to see necessarily around North America, but certainly one of the most toxic. They rank right up there with the Portuguese man o' war. And then what we normally think of when we think of cnidarians are the scyphozoans, or the jellies, or what you would commonly call jellyfish. Medusa is the dominant body form. They do have a short polyp stage in their life cycle when they sexually reproduce. Like all other cnidarians, they have those tentacles with those stinging cells on them, and very often we do find them close to shore. Although they'll also be found out in the open water. We tend to come into contact with them close to shore. It's not unusual for us to have jellyfish blooms along some of the coastlines, here in the United States. And you don't want to tangle up with them. Chances are, most of them that we normally see, the poison isn't bad enough that it's going to kill you, but it is going to cause a great deal of pain. Same basic life cycle design and everything that we see in the polyp forms, just upside down. Okay, those muscle fibers that would make the disc that it was sitting on make up the bell that it kind of relaxes and contracts to kind of guide itself through the water. The mouth and the gastrovascular cavity are beneath the organism instead of on top of, like we'd see in the polyp. So basically just flipped over and upside down. So I'm going to leave you guys there today. I'm going to start out tomorrow with a video about reproduction in this group, in particular reproduction in the corals, which is kind of interesting. And then we'll get into the phylum Ctenophora, which are the comb jellies, which most people kind of group together with jellyfish. They are very, very different animals. So we'll get into that tomorrow, and then keep on moving through our different phyla of invertebrates. So everybody have a good day, and we'll see you again tomorrow.